Hello, everyone. My name is Albert Świdziński. Welcome to another Strategy and Future podcast. And with me again, back is David Goldman. We've hosted David Goldman last year. It was one of our most successful podcasts. And while Seb Gorka would say he's a man who needs no introduction, I'll just include a brief one. David is a deputy editor and columnist at the Asia Times, an author of multiple books, most recently of the book called "You Will Be Assimilated: China's Plan to Sinoform the World." He's also a classical music critic. He was an advisor to the Reagan administration. I think it's safe to say to the previous administration as well. And he's, on a personal note, I must say this, I think he is the man who really creates or is instrumental in creating the understanding among the US elite as to what China is and how should China be countered. Whenever he hear a representative of the US who speaks sense on China, I can almost always spot, the keywords that David uses. So it's a terrific opportunity to have you back with us, David.
Well, thank you for those very kind words, Albert. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So, David, I would like to begin with "You Will Be Assimilated," the book that was released almost a year ago, or probably a bit under a year ago, which was very interesting because it was a very synthetic and very, compact way of describing what China is, what it isn't, what are misconceptions of the West as to what is the driving principle behind China, what are its goals, and what are the myths that should be discarded with about China. So that's a seemingly simple but misunderstood question as to what China is. And you write in your book that China is a country that remembers its founding emperor as a monster, but for millennia worshipped the emperor's civil engineer as a god. So you argue that China is not a nation, but an imperial principle that unifies different cultures. You describe specific characteristics of climate and terrain that they've directed China towards this. Could you give us a brief description as to how was China's evolution different and what it is today different to what we in the West understood as nation state?
This is a very old thesis which can be exaggerated about the geographic, if you will, characteristics of China and its effect on its development. But it's certainly the case that the 8,000 miles of the Yangtze and Yellow River were China's blessing and curse and defined the agenda for any Chinese government. China always had more people and until recently more wealth than anyone else because riparian agriculture, paddy farming in the river valleys produced 5 to 10 times more calories per acre than dry farming in, say, Mesopotamia or in Europe. So they could support a much larger population. China was enormously wealthy, but it also had the problem that the blessing, namely the river and the source of irrigation, also could be a curse because you had frequent floods leading to famines, plagues, and so forth. We know from archaeological excavations of 5,000 years ago that massive water management projects were already in place. And the evolution of the Chinese empire, which is formally founded by the Qin dynasty, from which we get the term China, roughly in the 4th century BC, begins with several great water management projects which transformed China. Qin Shi Huang, the first Chinese emperor, developed the financial resources to conquer the rest of his neighbors because he was able to irrigate 6,000 square miles of the Sichuan plain and make it the breadbasket of China, which it still remains. And the skills and technology that went into water management in ancient China are quite staggering. The same projects are in use today and still irrigate in the Sichuan plain. So China had two invariants through its history, which we still see today. One is the need for large-scale infrastructure, and the second is a managerial class to direct that infrastructure. The old Mandarin class, which has taken many forms. Every conqueror that's come to China, from whatever background, foreign, domestic, bandit, aristocratic, has found there's really only one way to run the country and has adapted to that. So the bandit rebellion of the 1930s and 40s, which called itself the Communist Party, a typical rural bandit rebellion, created a dynasty which, after many variations, found itself running China as a technocratic, top-down elite centered on infrastructure and technology. So in that sense, the Communist Party of China, with its 92 million members, is very much like the old Mandarin caste. It's simply much bigger. And the process of selection into the Chinese elite, which is standardized exams, now the Gaokao, the famous Chinese university entrance exam, is really not much different in principle from the old Mandarin exam. Now, you contrast this to what we call Judeo-Christian or Greco-Hebraic civilization. Greece and ancient Palestine, ancient Israel, are geographically fairly similar. There are no major rivers. Irrigation is by rainfall. The terrain lends itself to small freehold farms, which improve the land and maintain the topsoil through terraces. And that encourages small family farmers, mass armies where individuals own their own weapons, and, if you will, a spirit of freedom. I don't mean to suggest that we should look at geography as determinant of culture. There are many other places which had a different evolution. But nonetheless, the Western idea of individual autonomy never really took hold in China, not when you needed to assemble the labor of hundreds of thousands of people to produce massive projects. So China, for whatever reason, never developed the same idea of individual autonomy and sanctity of the human person and human life. China is not a nation state. It's always been an empire which has unified many different cultures. Today, a small minority of Chinese, fewer than 30%, speak the national language or national dialect, Mandarin, conversationally. But everyone reads the same characters. It's an extraordinary system where the written language is an imperial universal language, but no Chinese mother has ever sung her baby to sleep in Chinese. China, therefore, is always in danger of ethnic and cultural fissures. The centrifugal forces are always enormous, and the greatest problem of every Chinese dynasty has been to prevent China from breaking up. It has broken up many times in its history. When that's happened, the results have been catastrophic in terms of political chaos and loss of human life. That is why the Chinese communist leadership is so horrified at the prospect of a breakaway province like Taiwan, and why I believe China will indeed go to war to prevent Taiwan from becoming independent. The Chinese view is that if one province can become a rebel breakaway province, they all can, and therefore it's worth violence to prevent that happening anywhere. Same applies to Hong Kong. So a lot of Chinese behavior is a response to inherent weaknesses or tendencies to fracture in the system. There are many people in the West who think this is a good thing, that we should do our best to try to cause China to fracture. I don't think that's a good idea, given that it's 1.4 billion people, a very large part of the world economy, and has lots of nuclear weapons. The consequences of that could get out of control in a way that we would deeply regret if we were still around to regret it.
Sure. David, the interesting thing, of course, the another key point you make in your book is that we are on the junction point like no other in history when it comes to China. And again, if you allow me, I will quote. You wrote, "We stand at the cusp of one of history's great turning points. For thousands of years, China's internal weaknesses, natural disasters, famine, plague, civil unrest, and foreign invasion, kept China's attention turned inwards. We are now at the greatest turning point in Chinese history since the unification of China in the 3rd century before Christ. China is turning outward and looking hungrily on the world. And we look like a protein source. China doesn't want to rule you, it wants to assimilate you like the Borg in Star Trek, which is the point you make often in your speeches. And this also coincides with Chinese efforts to create Belt and Road, which essentially breaks the dominance of the maritime routes over the land routes. So how will that look? How will China proceed once it mastered the nature that kept it turned inwards? What's in store?
I think that China's approach to the rest of the world displays a continuity with its process of internal imperial expansion. The key to it was infrastructure. You lock people in to the imperial system. If you live on the Yangtze River, you had better pay taxes to the emperor because he's going to control the floods, which will go all along the river. He'll give you river transport, which you require. The centralizing force, the unifying force above all, is the infrastructure. So the Belt and Road idea, which is $2 trillion worth of infrastructure, not just ports and railroads and energy pipelines, but also a digital Silk Road, mobile broadband and all the technology that goes along with that, cloud computing, the integration of smartphones with big data servers. All of this creates what I call sinoforming of countries around China. China, of all the countries in the world, has been the most successful in taking large numbers of people out of absolute poverty and bring them to a modest middle-class level of consumption. Of course, Japan did this 100 years before China. Korea did it before China. So the Chinese experience is not unique. It's really, in a sense, an extension of the Japanese modernization after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. But China did it on a scale that no one else could think of. Now, if you look at the 7 or 8 billion inhabitants of the world, most of them live in countries which are quite poor, where most people don't have access to markets. They don't work in the formal economy. They don't pay taxes. They don't really receive services. They're not connected to global markets. China's combination of physical infrastructure and communications infrastructure is intended to bring these people into a Chinese centralized system, to integrate them into the world market in a way that, certainly will, in many cases, raise their living standards. This is not Belgian Congo kind of exploitation along the lines of 19th century imperialism. But above all, it will give China the access to the labor of billions of people. China's population is static. It may decline in the rest of the century. That's very hard to predict. Many people have said, well, China's nothing to worry about because it has stagnant demographics. Of course, Europe has stagnant demographics, and Japan's and Korea's demographics are even worse than China's. Leave that aside. There are a couple of billion people up for grabs as prospective workers, young workers for the next generation, and China wants to integrate them into the Chinese system. I saw this happen. My analysis, this is not, yes, exactly. This is not an academic thing. I was an investment banker, and I assisted Huawei, China's great telecommunications company, in developing its business with Mexico, with spectacular effect. 2015, I brought some Huawei officials to meet members of the Mexican government. That was simply because the Mexican ambassador to the United States was an old friend of mine, so I had the contacts. And at the time, I think 23% of Mexicans had a mobile broadband account. Last year, it was 77%. At the time, nobody in Mexico City, or certainly not the taxi drivers, used navigation apps like Waze or to get around Mexico City because broadband was too expensive. They couldn't afford it. Now, Mexico is the #3 market for Waze in the world, and its rate of growth of e-commerce is one of the fastest, if not the fastest last year. So the effect that Chinese investment, the Sinoforming of developing countries is having is extraordinary. Brazil is another example. Malaysia is another example. I would look at Turkey as a prospective example, certainly some of the Central European countries. All of this creates an enormous buffer around the Chinese economy, putting the labor of literally billions of people at the disposal of China. And it also brings in, particularly from Western Europe, it brings in a great deal of skills. This started with Huawei hiring Western scientists and engineers in telecommunications from European telecom equipment companies that Huawei had in fact put out of business. So Huawei has 50,000 employees in Western Europe. The vast majority of them are highly skilled. They're the largest employer of Western European telecom engineers. Huawei is not a Chinese company, strictly speaking. It is an imperial company, which has succeeded in harnessing the human capital of the West in a very large way. And of course, if you look at the great German industrial companies, the auto companies, companies like Siemens, the pharmaceutical companies, they have tens of thousands of R&D personnel in China. I think Siemens alone is about 5,000 engineers in China. Nokia has even more. So China is absorbing, Borg-like, the technical and cultural capacity of the West and putting it at the service of the Chinese economy. Not everything they're doing is bad. I've said many times, what we have to worry about is not what China does wrong, but what it does right. My concern is we should be doing these things right and not leaving it to the Chinese, because their political system is, to me personally, repugnant and generally unacceptable to Western sensibility.
David, we're with the Mexico remark, we're diving straight into the difficult questions. I wanted to keep them for a bit later, but let's do this. Because the thing I mentioned, following the fall of Constantinople and the sewering of the original Silk Road, ultimately led to great discoveries, but ultimately also led to the great dominance and accumulation of capital in the maritime nations, and the Netherlands, and London, in the UK, and so on and so forth. But this essentially also meant that the distribution of wealth, of innovation, became very skewed. And what you say about Chinese system, I understand it, and that's a difficult question. That's a rude question, really, when it comes to the great politics. But for all the downsides, the ecosystem Chinese are attempting to create, the one you speak of, one that reaches the capillaries of the society, offers a way out of this being locked down, unless you're a high capital, high innovation intensive place. It offers an opportunity to move up the value chain for places neglected and left in the international system. You write about the sustenance farming and people sitting all day trying to sell a bottle of oil, basically it offers a way up the value chain. So those places that were permanently neglected were a source of cheap manual labor, now are offered, obviously, within the Sinocentric system, but they are offered a legible way out. And the West doesn't seem to offer this. Why not take that offer?
Well, I think the West has tended to be risk averse in terms of committing resources to developing countries. And part of that is that the political obstacles and political risk associated with the developing world often make it uneconomical to do so. I've heard Chinese officials complain bitterly about the corruption and incompetence of the Mexican government, despite their successes. Their experience has not been entirely happy. And that's the same, that's also true in Colombia, where Huawei is a huge force, and in Brazil, where Huawei is a huge force, and it's doubly true in Africa. However, because the United States pretty much, could keep Huawei out of large parts of the Western world, that's where Huawei had to go. That's where the Chinese have gone for minerals and other aspects of economic development. So I think the Chinese experience is, at least in the short term, a very mixed one. There are many Belt and Road projects which have failed. There have been a lot of write-offs. Partly that's because the Chinese don't have a great deal of experience in dealing with countries outside themselves. They don't produce a lot of people who speak the languages, know the cultures, have lived there for a long time, have the personal contacts. Secondly, I think the Chinese, in many cases, were naive about the political problems they might face. So Belt and Road is certainly not an unambiguous success. There's been a lot of criticism of it. A lot of it's been done very badly. Nonetheless, what it represents in terms of economic project does threaten to shift the weight of the world economy towards China, because as the demography of the West catches up with us, as we age in the West, China will have first call on the world's young people. There are a couple of places, for example, where China is now very active, which have enormous human capital potential. One is Iran, and another is Turkey. Iran produces very smart university graduates. Very large number of them emigrate and go somewhere else. But Iranian students have distinguished themselves at foreign universities all around the world. If China goes through with this proposed $400 billion 25-year investment program with Iran and harnesses Iranian skills to the Chinese industrial machine, it could be quite impressive. Same with Turkey. Turkey has several universities which are pretty much as good for engineering as anything in Europe. They hire a lot of European faculty. They've got they've got a skilled workforce. The place has been grossly mismanaged, with enormous inflation, a lot of corruption, but also a great deal of potential. Now that you've got railroads that go from Beijing to Ankara and beyond to Europe, it's very possible that Turkey will start doing a lot of the manufacturing assembly for Chinese companies for re-export to Europe. And of course, Poland, as you know, has built the largest air freight center in Europe, precisely in anticipation of more trade from the East.
I think it's fairly public knowledge among people who read Strategy and Future that I was there at the very early stages. I was an employee of Central Transport Hub, but I must say the Chinese were embargoed as far as STH was concerned. But that is a different story, and certainly, it would be much better to service the U.S. traffic or Western traffic. But if it's moving through established routes, it goes back to the opportunity. If it's moving through established routes through Frankfurts, and whence Polish population is supposed to keep, their place in the value chain and not try to move up. If somebody offers an opportunity, this is what you look for, despite all the drawbacks. But the interesting thing, very early in the book, you do away with a number of myths about China, about what it is, what it isn't. And you mention a couple of them, and I wanted to bring them up because this is what we hear all the time in Poland when somebody's critical of China or dismissive of China, rather, not critical. And these are things like Chinese can innovate, or China will be crushed under a mountain of debt, or that its meager demographic growth will cause its collapse. If you could just give me a brief tour d'horizon, why are those wrong?
Well, let me start with one myth that particularly irks me, which is that China has a secret plan to take over the world through unrestricted warfare. This thesis was advanced by Michael Pillsbury. I know Michael reasonably well. We both worked for the same consultant, the same office of the Pentagon years ago. And he took a volume written by a couple of Chinese colonels more than 20 years ago called Unrestricted Warfare, and asserted that it was a blueprint for a secret, nefarious, conspiratorial plan for Chinese world domination. It happens that the authors of this book were not promoted. They were kicked out of the army. They were hung out to dry in academic positions. No one really took this seriously because the thesis of the book was China can't afford to make massive investments in military technology. Instead, it should use all kinds of guerrilla and other means of subversion against the United States. That was rejected. The Chinese instead opted for massive investments in military and dual-use technologies, which is why they're on Mars, why they've got astronauts in the space station, why they were the first country in the world to land on the dark side of the moon. This is impressive stuff. And the Chinese didn't have a space program 10 years ago. And now they may not be quite where the United States is, but they're getting close. That's one myth. Another myth is that China's debt mountain will crush it. Well, China's debt to GDP ratio is about the same as the United States and, in fact, most European countries. Countries that have a very high savings rate, have a current account surplus, and economic growth do not have financial crises. They can lend the money to themselves. Lots of Chinese companies will be reorganized. They're zombies left over from the era of state control. And there will be a lot of bankruptcies, but it doesn't mean the system will go bankrupt. I'm much more worried about the United States, which has, according to most estimates, well over $100 trillion, of long-term unfunded liabilities for its Social Security and pension systems. Most of the debt of China is concentrated around infrastructure. Most of that infrastructure is productive. For example, the high-speed rail, people thought this might be a white elephant, but for the most part, these trains are packed all the time. The utilization rate is quite high. China does have some problems in its real estate market. That's a structural problem. We can go into that later. It's not a fatal problem, but it is a significant problem. And the main myth I would like to address is the notion that China is a communist country with ambitions for world domination along the lines of the Soviet Union. I'm an old Cold Warrior. The Soviet Union was a wicked entity which occupied its neighbors, obviously including Poland, and would love to have occupied the rest of the world. It sponsored communist parties to be engaged to conduct subversion and hopefully, from their standpoint, revolutions everywhere in the world. China has never had the ambition to rule other countries. As I said, it assimilates, it doesn't rule. The Chinese, if you tell the Chinese, do you think we in America should adopt your political system? They'll laugh at you. They'll say, you can't adopt our political system. We have a meritocracy. We have standardized exams. Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard, but she couldn't go to Peking University because she didn't have a high enough exam score. Advancement in the Chinese system is the cleanest form of meritocracy in the world. For all the corruption, all the privilege, all the bad things we know, there's one aspect of China which every Chinese is aware of, which is if your kid studies hard enough and gets a high score in the Gaokao and goes to a good university, that child will have an excellent career, which is why the average Chinese family spends the equivalent of a year's pay on tutoring, including all the music lessons we were talking about before. This is not Russian-style communism. This is not a second Cold War. It's an entirely different entity and a much more dangerous one. You know, I remember talking to drunken, worthless, bootlicking, stupid Russian communist bureaucrats in the 1970s and 1980s and thinking them really contemptible creatures. if you meet people in power in China, it's like talking to, you're talking to the top exam scores in the country. Whatever they aren't stupid, and they don't drink too much, except, of course, the military types.
And this brings me to what, to basically, you wrote, there is no quick fix, no immediate answer, no golden mean of dealing with China, because this is what the US would be looking for in this situation. It finds itself, I would like to think that it's possible. But it's not. As you said, it's a 5,000-year-old meritocracy, ruthless, absolutely ruthless, but also very effective. So there's no quick fix. What should the US do? How should it approach its rivalry with Chinese?
I think the rise of China should be an occasion for sober self-reflection on the part of the United States. Our single biggest problem, the fatal flaw that could kill us, is our complacency. We won the Cold War. In 1990, we were the world's only hyperpower. We have the strongest relative position in the world of any entity since Rome, since ancient Rome. Unprecedented. We could do what we wanted. So we stopped working hard, and we stopped investing heavily in keeping an R&D and manufacturing edge. We decided that we didn't have to do the dirty work of making things. We could do the software, which was cleaner, and have other people do the manufacturing. We found out eventually that without manufacturing, you lose innovation. And the kind of things that we made the most money doing were things that were really like the Roman bread and circuses, the cheap entertainments.
Sure.
We've created a generation of people who are entertained by their smartphones, and kids who are 16 years old and don't like to leave their bedrooms. They're less interested in adventure, in work, even less interested in sex than the previous generation. There's some very good academic work on this. So I think we have to take a hard look at ourselves and restore the kind of great national goals in terms of scientific and technical accomplishment, like the John F. Kennedy moonshot, for example. We need great goals. We need resources that meet those goals. We need a sense of national purpose and a meritocracy that rewards accomplishment. We've moved, in fact, sadly, in exactly the opposite direction towards what is it called? Diversity, inclusiveness, and equity, or DIE for short. We have engineering departments run by diversity officers who want to make sure that we've got enough minorities going into the engineering departments to to show that we're virtuous. So I think we need a national revival. We need to go back to the kind of policies that worked very well during the Cold War under Eisenhower, Kennedy, and indeed Reagan, even to some extent under Jimmy Carter, and do what we did then instead of what we're doing now. Other than that, we have to reconcile ourselves to being the number 2 power in the world.
Greeks in the Roman Empire, or geeks, as you prefer it.
Yes, right. We'll write the apps. We'll be the geeks in the
Sure.
Roman Empire.
Sure. But this is, I think I will go back to this in a moment, because this ties into Biden's proposed, real industrial policy, which is something you've been asking for ages. But maybe if you allow me in a second, because I wanted to stick for a moment with what you said about atrophy of competitiveness in the West. And I think this ultimately stems from the elites. And this is more of a meta level question. But what happened with the elites in the West? Why were they so complacent? Why the negative selection to the elites? And how do you manage that? How do you reverse that trend?
Well, America's elite went through several different incarnations. The original elite was the Massachusetts Puritan elite that had a strong religious foundation, had a vision of the United States as distinguished among nations, a new mission in the desert, a new city on a hill with a very biblical self-conception. That elite fought and won the Civil War. After the Civil War, I think the cost of the Civil War led to what we call progressivism, the old kind of progressivism. The idea that clever people and social engineers can fix all the problems of the world. So that was, the welfare state domestically and Wilsonian foreign policy internationally. It was associated with ideas like the social gospel. So after World War II, when the United States was the most powerful country in the world, we believed that we could fix the world any way we wanted. That was the time of Allen Dulles as head of CIA, John Foster Dulles as head of the State Department. That was the mainline Protestant elite. That crashed and burned with the Vietnam War, which was a terrible humiliation for the United States. And the post-Vietnam elite was still very clever, but they believed very much in the invention of identity according to one's own predilections, a much more individualistic and, well, if you will, utopian idea of the human personality, and much less religious. So if you go to Silicon Valley, you meet almost no religious people. America used to be a religious country. Most people believe that human beings are going to eventually blend with machines, that the human brain and artificial intelligence will converge, and that some kind of computation will solve all the world's problems. And because they made fabulous amounts of money in software, they believe that they can solve every problem in the world by managing it from the top. So you have a bunch of, if you will, mad scientists running loose with vast amounts of money who believe that they can impose solutions on the ignorant, unwashed, ordinary Americans, which will be good for them or will be along the lines of their ideology. So, for example, why make such an issue out of transgenderism? There are really very few transgender people. In the United States, 15% of Americans responded to a recent poll saying they knew someone who was transgender. In Europe, it was all less than 10%, usually 3-4%. Americans have, our strength and our weakness is we invent our identity. We don't have thousands of years of history. We're not Poles or Germans or Italians. Poles come to the United States and they become Americans. In a few years, we're going to get a citizenship. People think of you as an American. If I move to Poland and learn to speak Polish, which of course I don't speak sadly, nobody would think of me as a Pole, maybe after 3 or 4 generations of my kids. We know how to reinvent ourselves, but when we do so on an arbitrary or capricious basis, we end up producing madness. So we have an elite which is so self-confident because of the amount of money it's produced, and so caught up with the idea that technical wizardry and software in particular, computation, can solve all the world's problems, that they have a very distorted view of humanity. And since that is the segment of the elite which has made most of the money in the past 20 years, they have a disproportionate influence. That's sad, and it might be our undoing.
If I could, because when you're speaking about the elite and the way the evolution of norms in the US takes place, you made a very interesting link between Protestant zeal, like Salem witch trials, and the current atmosphere, the political atmosphere in the United States. And it was really interesting intellectual figure how to describe it. Could you go over this, like in brief, at least?
Well, there has always been a messianic or millenarian tendency among radical Protestants to try to bring about the millennium quickly and to look at any opposition to that as the work of the devil. So in our original founding, we have the great embarrassment that the Puritan founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony engaged in one of the last and most destructive witch trials in Western Europe. It wasn't one of the last, the big ones in the 1690s. They, of course, apologized for it, and they publicly took responsibility for their actions. But this tendency towards fanaticism is reproduced in an almost clownish parody at American universities. What's the biggest social problem we have in the United States? It's the economic failure of African Americans, of our Black population. And one of the most important gauges of that failure is the fact that only about a third of Black males who enter university graduate. Roughly the same proportion of Black and white males enter university. Slightly higher for whites, but not that much. But only a third of Black males graduate, as opposed to about 2/3 of white males. So that's a catastrophic development. We have failed to develop a skilled, prosperous Black middle class because of it. Now, why is that the case? Well, I think obviously lack of preparation, cultural pathologies, and so forth explain it, though one can't say that. The only explanation one is allowed to give is it's racism.
Privilege.
And if there's no overt racism, well, there must be covert racism. If there's no obvious aggression, there must be microaggressions. So if Blacks are failing, particularly young Black men at university are failing, and you can't find any overt explanation, then you have to look for the secret occult presence of racism, which somehow magically causes it. And that is literally a witch hunt.
I'm gonna just a quick diversion. This reminds me of what Chesterton wrote about virtues running wild without a larger, structure over governing them. Christian morality in that case. And it seems that this is very similar with what you described, right? This is the same kind of madness that, the morality taken to absurd, conclusion, right? In a way.
Well, it's what Voegelin called immanentizing the eschaton. It's a millenarian idea that we're going to bring about heaven on earth.
Sure.
And once you do that, people who oppose you are obviously agents of Satan and have to be rooted out. And if something bad happens, there's no obvious cause. There must be a witch. So you take some old lady out and you burn her.
Sure.
And if that doesn't solve the problem, it means there's another witch. So you find another old lady and you burn her too. In this case, we don't burn people, we just burn their careers.
Yeah. Okay, David, since we don't have forever, I must now pick my question. So maybe the one that really has been bugging me back to current day is, how exactly is the Chinese economic ecosystem going to look like, and what is its role? What is the role of digital yuan within it? And you argued very persuasively that to think of digital RMB as a replacement for the dollar is a great oversimplification that is missing the point. It's only a part of the ecosystem and data. And if you could, corresponding to the role of the dollar, explain the concept of seigniorage. You spoke about this.
Yes, but certainly. For the last several hundred years, the foundation of finance has been the bill of exchange and trade. And if you want to order, if I'm sitting in Wobegon, Wisconsin, and I want to order nails from China, I put a deposit down at the bank. I contact the exporter. The exporter's bank checks that I have money on deposit. It accepts my bill of exchange, and I wait for however months it takes until a load of nails comes to my hardware store in Wisconsin, and then the money is transferred to the exporter with the banks acting as intermediary. So something like $30 trillion, by my rough guess, of capital is tied up in this system. Now, used to be even more capital was tied up in international trade. in the 16th century, when the Spanish Empire literally paid for its imports in bullion, the Spanish Empire had to build mines in the New World, send ships to move bullion, organize a navy to protect those ships against pirates. Some very large part of the whole national product of Spain was devoted to acquiring and moving the means of circulation. Bills of exchange are much more efficient. Now, imagine a system where you know where every ounce of iron ore is from a Brazilian mine, what container it went to, what ship it's in, what foundry it's going to in Harbin, China, what rolling mill it's going to, what warehouse it goes to, and where everything is continuously. You can verify the transfer of the product at every stage. You're going to need a lot less capital. And you can use digital payments to advance this process at each stage. This is what's called the Internet of Things, where the presence and status of products at every stage of production is available in a data server, and you have complete information transparency. At that point, you're not going to need $30 trillion worth of capital to maintain international trade. You need a fraction of that, just as the Bank of England system of bills of exchange required a fraction of the capital that the Spanish Empire needed when it used bullion to pay its requirements. What that implies is that the deposits in the banking system should shrink. The amount of balances you require to maintain transactions will drop. Now, as it happens, because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, most of that $30 trillion is an interest-free loan to the United States of America. So that source of financial support for America will shrink. The role of reserve currencies, as we understand them, will shrink because we won't need as many reserves. Technology will replace the reserves. So this is not a financial story as such. It's a real economic story. The advent of smart logistics, of big data, of the Internet of Things will simply make the role of banks less important, reduce the deposit base, but because that's the foundation of the dollar as a reserve currency, that reduces the power of the United States. It's not as if the Chinese want to take the RMB and replace the dollar and do what the dollar is now doing. They're doing something entirely different, which will transform the system and make the dollar less important.
And this happens, as you point out, often in Asia times at the moment when the US or Fed is doing whatever it can to debase its the US currency. You speak almost every week. There is at least one article about inflation in the US, and it's usually concluded with the words "be afraid, be very afraid." And so I wanted to ask about the liquidity that is being pumped into the US, M2, M1 that is being pumped into the US economy. What is the danger here in basic terms, and can the Fed even stop at this point in time, or is it like they cannot stop spiking the punch bowl?
Well, if you take a warm bottle of soda and take off the cap and put your thumb over the top and shake it, you know what the result is going to be. The only question is when. And it's not going to be it won't be pleasant when it happens. After the COVID-19 economic shock, the United States put a huge amount of money into the hands of Americans. They basically threw money out of the helicopter. As an initial response to an exogenous shock, that probably was justified. But now it's $5 trillion worth, and the Biden administration wants to do more. To pay for that, the Federal Reserve took $5 trillion for almost of federal debt onto its balance sheet and effectively created that much money. So if you create massive amounts of demand without creating supply, you're going to get inflation. That's the definition of inflation. And of course, we have the highest inflation rates in a generation. Short term, the Federal Reserve has said this will be transitory. Yes, I was saying the definition of inflation is a lot of demand and not enough supply. So we see supply chains in the United States and indeed throughout the world overwhelmed by the amount of demand. We're seeing the longest delays for delivery of goods that we've ever seen in the various surveys of manufacturers conducted by different entities in the United States. We're seeing the prices paid for goods by U.S. manufacturers are rising at the fastest rate on record. This is inflation. Now, that inevitably leads to a recession at some point, because if prices keep going up, eventually people will stop paying them. And we're already seeing some signs of resistance to the higher prices. That's a very concerning thing. You mentioned before the Biden administration's proposals for industrial and technological investment. This is the right idea. I don't think the implementation has been particularly effective. My own view is that our biggest problem is the decapitalization of the U.S. economy. The tax system creates huge incentives for people to invest in businesses that use very little capital and are harmful to businesses that use a lot of capital. So we need a tax system that rewards capital-intensive investment as well as R&D. Simply throwing a lot of money at university laboratories won't necessarily solve the problem. By itself, it's not a bad thing to do, but it's not nearly enough. So I believe instead of creating more demand, we should have created more investment and spent our money that way. We've made a big mistake. I don't know if we have time to correct it.
And another thing you mentioned when you wrote your Chimerica article is that basically by this point in time, the Chinese are underwriting the US loose fiscal policy. And you suggested that essentially what it means that they will be toning down the rivalry.
Well, here's the problem. The United States wants to spend a lot of money. We can't produce enough to spend the money. So we import more. Our current account deficit is up to $1 trillion a year. It hasn't been that high since the mid-2000s. There isn't enough domestic production to meet the demand, so it will come from outside. China is getting most of those orders. China is the only supply chain strong enough to meet that kind of demand. And even so, the Chinese supply chain has been a bit stretched. So China has a trade surplus of $500 billion a year with the United States. We need China to take the dollars that we're paying them for goods and reinvest them in our treasury securities, which makes us doubly dependent on China, both for the physical imports and secondly for reinvestment of the proceeds. So it makes it very hard for the Biden administration to treat China as an enemy when we're so dependent on it. Now, it's not impossible because governments can be schizophrenic. You can have the Pentagon go in one direction and the Treasury in another. But nonetheless, the fact that for all the talk about decoupling from China, we've become more dependent on China in the past year should really make us examine whether we're doing the right thing.
This is very interesting because I read your article and then a couple of days later when I was doing my rundown of world news for our readers, I've stumbled upon three things that made me think that the US is basically withdrawing from acute phase of rivalry with China. It was Janet Yellen saying they don't want full decoupling, that it would be bad and it would destroy global value chains. And of course, the tech war was the war that the US was trying to fight, and then it's over. Economist Intelligence Unit also released a report saying that the US will not be able to reshore at all, that it's overblown, and that any reshoring from Asia to the US is exception to the rule. And then Mark Miley, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, said that China is not likely to invade Taiwan at all, and they cannot do this. And this stands in stark contrast with what Indo-PACOM commander said in March, and when he said it's six years. So all this seems like toning it down and accepting that certain things cannot be managed anymore, and the war cannot be won in an acute phase. If that's the case, what will the US do?
Well, what did Britain do after the loss of its empire? It was poor for years. I was a graduate student in Britain in the 1970s. I was impressed by the fact that most of the buildings stank of mildew, that heating came from a gas fire, that you had to take a hot water bottle to bed in the winter because it was too cold. People ate roast beef for Sunday, but then ate leftovers the rest of the week. And civil servants bought cheap cigarettes called Woodbines and smoked them down to the last 2 millimeters. Britain was poor. Britain's living standard is about 40% below where it would be if it had the same growth rate as the United States. So we'll be poor, we'll be weaker, we won't disappear, but China will be the dominant world power. The world will be a very different place. As I said, I don't think China wants to rule us. They think we're barbarians, so they are incurious about how we barbarians choose to rule ourselves as long as they're the dominant power.
As you, and this is, I think, again, wrapping up, I know we're almost out of time. Wrapping up, you said this before. Again, I'm an avid student, I must say. You said the US might turn into what the UK was, sans the social cohesion that the United Kingdom once had. But this is, this goes back, this goes into future, and I do hope we will have a chance to speak again, perhaps sooner than a year from now. Especially
it would be my pleasure.
Thank you. Especially looking how things are in the Eastern Europe, because history is really back over here. It really is, David. So again, great pleasure. Thank you so much. Our guest today was David Goldman. Thank you so much, David.
My pleasure entirely.